Fair enough.
Look out! Leon, the plane!
Him again? Friend of yours? More like an ex-girlfriend. Guy doesn't know when to quit. Welcome to the club.
Welcome back to the Retro Review, where we look back on and review games current and past. Today we look back on Resident Evil 6. Released in 2012, it was supposed to be the explosive climax to the strong financial and critically acclaimed string of Resident Evil titles that made Capcom one of the most successful video game companies of all time, and at the time. Did the game land though? Somewhat, to be fair. It is still one of the best-selling Resident Evil titles even today, but fatigue and the direction of the long-storied franchise soured immensely in the faces of its fans and critics alike. It's been well over a decade since it's released, and today we look back on Resident Evil 6. First off, here's the background and context. Resident Evil 6 boiled down is a game primarily doing one of two things that coincide with one another. First, it was following in the era of action-heavy shooters in the similar vein of Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, Rainbow Six, etc., etc., leaning heavily into the action shooter elements primarily of the time, while technological advancements allowed for the use of online functionality, allowing players to play around the world together. Ironically, something Resident Evil attempted to do years prior with the Outbreak games. Second, the franchise already going in that direction, changing from the tank-controlled survival horror elements we knew from back in the day to a more diverse control scheme and action elements presented in both Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5. By the way, still released and is still by far one of Capcom's highest-selling video games to this day. Resident Evil 6 largely got rid of the tank controls and was supposed to be the epic and in some ways a conclusion for a lot of these bioterrorism storylines that they were telling over the course of 15 years. Did they succeed though, is I think a different question that has to be explained. Starting with the story, the game is separated into 4 campaigns. Leon's campaign, which is generally, to most people, is supposed to be the blend of survival horror and action elements. Chris's, which effectively is just a straight up action shooter and the most action heavy within the game. Jake's is a little different, a little strange, as there is a push for more melee combat, unlike the other 2 campaigns. And finally, Ada's campaign, which is the most intriguing and confusing mixture of story and gameplay that I have ever seen, and I think a lot of people do have and take a lot of issue in particular with Ada's campaign. Now, if you actually played through the game in, the order that it's supposed to be played in, starting with Leon, Chris, Jake, and Ada, admittedly, I think it is interesting enough as the entire story isn't fully fleshed out until really Ada's campaign. But I do appreciate them attempting to build the intrigue of the story as it builds over time, and threads are created that much of the campaigns largely answer in subsequent playthroughs. Now, this won't be an entire comprehensive story overview and thoroughly explained, but generally speaking, this is just going to be the Cliff Notes version of what the Resident Evil 6 story largely is. It goes like this. Neo Umbrella is a bioterrorist organization created by a young researcher named Carla, who worked for and fell in love with Derek Simmons, the National Security Advisor for the United States, who is also a part of the Family, a secret Illuminati-type group controlling the world and world events, putting people in positions of power to control the world as they see fit, and mingle in, extracurricular activities such as bioengineering and weapons development. Simmons himself is in love with the titular famous Ada Wong. Not sure if it was a relationship or just, admiration from afar, but the feelings were not reciprocated, which in turn drove Simmons to use and test the newly developed C-virus on a willing subject, that girl being Carla, to transform her physically into Ada Wong, albeit it's not her, and ultimately he rejects her. In some ways, I guess you could say, largely, the events of the game are a product of a very, let's say, screwy Frankenstein experiment gone exponentially wrong, with the love triangle ultimately thrown in for good measure. Carla, rejected, begins forming and retaliating with her own plans as revenge for the rejection, via behind the scenes by improving the C virus, and is largely the reason for a bioterrorist attack that was launched in China. The other characters play their parts in this jacked up love triangle. Leon's story is him figuring out Simmons' role in all this as he uncovers with Helena, the basically Secret Service officer, and trying to figure out who killed the president and why all this is happening, as he uncovers Simmons' role in killing the president, wiping out the citizens, and Leon's campaign and the confrontation where Carla injects Simmons with a strain of the C virus as revenge. Chris and Jake's campaigns somewhat go hand in hand together, so I'll explain them both here. Jake is Albert Wesker's son. Spoilers. With a special blood that makes him immune to the effects of the virus. He is a rebel fighting alongside the bioengineered terrorists and is rescued by Sherry Birkin to be brought back to Simmons for a cure, only to be captured by Carla and tested on to improve the effects of the virus. Chris is on the other side, with the BSAA attempting to stop the bioterrorist attack with his allies, and a true ride or die, Piers, where he loses his men at the hands of Carla. Their stories intersect and interact yet again in China, where, after 6 months, Jake having enough, weirdly, of testing, he and Sherry escape the facility with the aid of Chris and Piers, who are back in action after Chris goes on a drinking bender. Captured again, Jake and Sherry are rescued by Chris and Piers in the underwater base where Carla's last move, a giant bioweapon, Haos, I don't know how to actually pronounce it, is to be unleashed onto the world. Now, A's campaign takes place largely in generally all parts of the other three campaigns, while she attempts to uncover and directly basically discover Carla's plot to frame her for all the bioterrorist attacks, which ultimately all the threads are largely explained, and the backstory of the entire game is explained through Ada's campaign. So, what does that mean? Personally, story-wise, admittedly, while overwhelmingly convoluted and built on the strangest framework, although it's not the strangest in all of the series, looking at Code Veronica, basically on a love triangle of sorts, is still very, very intriguing, and the game does well to a degree, attempting to convey the story in a very interesting way. The best way I could probably put it is this: there is something here, literally is the only way I can articulate it. There is something here in this chaos of a convoluted plot that, if done differently, or hypothetically even, in a remake, can be made, I think, into an actually really streamlined and genuinely intriguing narrative. It's not the best Resident Evil story, but it's, I think personally, far from the worst. It's basically just how it ultimately unfolds, and how it's told, I think, is the issue with the game itself and the story itself. That's not to say that there aren't issues or problems within the game. I think what gets lost in aspects of it, if anything, that make me and suspect others take a step back from actually playing the game or taking the plot seriously, are many plot inconsistencies, and at times strange characterizations and behaviors that don't conform to make it a believable story. I think one of the best examples of this is probably Leon's campaign, where the president is literally dead. Helena had a hand in it, but is unwilling to divulge the truth until they go to the cathedral. Literally 2 chapters of Leon just going along with, oh, the president's dead, but I'll follow her. Basically just try to, get some more information out instead of actually, doing his job. Makes it a very difficult, basically, just to believe anything that this story ultimately has to offer, and make this a story that I can't fully take seriously. Okay, bioterrorist attack with the city. I'm just gonna, kind of just go along with this girl who I really have no idea about while the president's dead. Now, I mean, you can argue it's part of just a Resident Evil thing with just how characters go along with it and just, stories and gameplay itself just to get a plot going and plot through, but still relative inconsistency, especially with how this Leon is taking things as seriously as he is. Now, graphically, the game looks fine and truly beautiful and great at times. I believe it uses the MT framework, which I believe is standard for most Capcom games at the time until they came out with the new RE engine. That being said, I think there are some issues with it, obviously. Character models look strange, mainly in their facial animations at times, with over-exaggerated expressions. Backgrounds of the destroyed cities and certain environments don't really leave a lot to the imagination and just look like pre-rendered stuff that doesn't look very, very good or diverse. Despite that, the game does look great, working well with lighting in certain scenes, which is why Leon tends to be the best looking and most creative aesthetically, because it is really, really dark and uses, I think, those lighting effects and the environments that they're in to basically just to the best degree out of all 3 or all 4 campaigns. Graphically, it's fine, and it's fine for the time and era that it ultimately was released in. But admittedly, whether due to time, since this game was released effectively 4 years after Resident Evil 5, or just personal internal choices made at Capcom, this game at least looks far less polished than it probably should be. It looks very muddled in comparison, for instance, to Resident Evil 5. It may just be the use of lighting and maybe just the general contrast is heightened, but the game looks muddled far more and less sharp than its predecessor, which was released several years before. I'm thinking maybe it's due to time, or really just, time, really just to get the game out. But ultimately, it's still a good looking game that does fall short, at least to its predecessor. Gameplay is a very mixed bag for me, and for many, I'd assume, who have actually played this game. It is the first Resident Evil game that, if I'm correct, that actually doesn't use, in some variation or fashion, tank controls. I could be wrong, but I feel real free movement in this game in comparison to Resident Evil 5, which I do believe still uses tank controls. This lends it to be a more open and just different gameplay and variation on gameplay and combat experience, allowing one for, anyone to do a multitude of different combinations of melee and firearm combat with, let's just say, mixed results. In retrospect, and after replaying it again, it's not a complicated system or really a complicated game to play, but to master what I think they intended to do really does take time and might turn off some people due to its convoluted nature, meaning the game will be far harder for you if you are unable to master or really improve your ability on the control scheme. This game can be fun, although repetitive and not in the ways that would want me personally to come back and playing the game. But even to this day, there are still people playing this game online, and if you want to jump into an online session, people still play it and enjoy it and have fun. And hey, to each their own. I think what is unfortunate too, at least to a certain degree, is the predecessors of the game, and especially after replaying it, the Resident Evil 4 remake. Resident Evil 4 and 5 in particular, I think are good examples of what I think is a simple control scheme. While not perfect, are simple enough and yet complex enough to make players want to come back. It's not overly convoluted, it's something that ultimately just requires a couple button presses, and it feels like at the very least you can do a lot within the game. The more positive aspects of combat are the variations in how you can play basically each campaign. Leon's campaign has the zombies and feels like more of a mid-2000s classic Resident Evil type of experience with some extra melee combat included. Chris is a straight-up gun game, while Jake's again is a strange and weird mixture of the two. Ada, unfortunately, is by far the most confusing gameplay-wise and probably my least favorite. The implementation of her grapple gun and her being solo makes this game a little bit more difficult, and strangely having probably the more, I don't want to say difficult puzzles, but probably I've noticed more puzzles in her campaign than pretty much any of the other Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 6 campaigns, and largely are the more difficult ones. In terms of a fun experience, Leon's is probably the funnest, because at the very least in terms of its combat, it plays probably far more like Resident Evil 4 really than anything else out of the other 3 campaigns. Chris is just a straight up shooter, which is fine, and I think the gunplay is very good with added boulder punching from him. I do like Jake's campaign surprisingly, because I do like the actual hand-to-hand melee combat that the game ultimately does produce. Ada's is the mixed bag with combat, primarily because you are solo, and I think she does have the more unique variety of enemies that do make it a little bit more of a slog. And again, like I said, I want to reiterate, puzzles I think are really fun and enjoyable, and I also don't want to spend more than 5 minutes figuring out a puzzle if it's going to be really convoluted, and there is absolutely not a lot of hints, or really just with how the game is structured makes it very difficult to determine what is actually a part of the room and actually a part of the puzzle. And I think that's just the general assessment of the gameplay. It's something that other people may enjoy, to each their own, to whatever you enjoy and prefer. It certainly isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea, and at times can be very difficult or convoluted or a general drag, and that makes the experience less fun for other people. It really just depends. If you want to take the time to actually master the combat, you can absolutely do it. But it is also something that I think for a lot of people might be very difficult to get into, and for someone like me, who I'm not the most skilled gamer, I think I'm relatively competent, can be very difficult and less enjoyable if I'm not actively doing every single button press, which again, I think another issue with the game at times can be the responsiveness of the actual, little quick time events and all that actually allow you to manipulate the gameplay to your liking. I think they're not as reactive as they probably could or should be. I will say this in conclusion: Resident Evil 6 received a lot of flack during its initial release. Despite selling over 10 million copies as of today and receiving more than enough criticism, that the company completely changed course due to the complaints and issues with Resident Evil 6. It is not a bad game. I wouldn't call it a good game either. It is a game that people will either really enjoy and play for an hour and drop it and really never play it again. People still play it even today. Thanks to subsequent re-releases, it does have a following. It's a game that, like I said before, there is something there. It's like a movie that isn't particularly good, but has some appeal or aspect that you really like that puts it higher on a rank than something that's actually bad. It is a rushed and relatively convoluted mess that was supposed to be the Resident Evil epic game that we were all waiting for, only for it to crash and somewhat faceplant, and because of all the backlash that Capcom faced, was really the turning point that thankfully the franchise ultimately changed course, going back more to its series roots. It's an okay game that, unfortunately, I don't think has really aged all that well. But that doesn't mean it's unplayable or completely unenjoyable. I want you all to play it for yourself if you haven't picked it up, or play it again, give it a second look. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you guys like and subscribe.
We've received new orders.
Alright. Better get to it then.
Yes, sir.